Somewhat coincidentally, I found myself fairly immersed in Second World War history over the past while. I watched the movie Dieppe, I read a book about D-Day, I've played some games with Second World War themes, and that's cool with me. It's a history that has always fascinated me. Ever since I was young, I read books about the war, and I have a grandfather who, as an infantryman with the Montreal Black Watch, fought for the liberation of Europe towards the end of the war. So it's definitely something that's always captured my interest. So let's start with the film. I hardly ever watch movies, to be honest with you. I'm not a huge fan of how Hollywood portrays the world in general. However, I had a gift certificate and I wanted to see Valerian and the City of 1,000 something or other, but it was out of the theaters already, so I went to see Dieppe instead. What I think Dieppe did really well was capture a mood. They really put the viewer in the shoes of the various participants of that evacuation and helped generate the emotions that might have been felt by the people involved with that. I also really appreciated that they chose to use real people and real equipment and didn't go for a lot of the CGI stuff, which I'm not a huge fan of in movies. So the fact that they went to the effort of gathering hundreds of people and all this gear to make the movie was pretty cool. What I don't feel the film did quite as well was really capture the history, the fact that 330,000 soldiers were evacuated over the course of 10 days, and the fact that most of them were evacuated via naval vessels and a much smaller amount by the private civilian craft that came across the channel. Although there were far more civilian craft that evolved with the evacuation, the fact that a single destroyer could hold thousands of soldiers meant that a handful of military vessels could get the bulk of the soldiers across the channel. I think around 30,000 ended up going across on the private vessels, which is still a large number considering the fact that the Allied commanders only thought they would get about 45,000 safely evacuated, and they ended up getting around 330,000 in total. So as for me, I would generally rather just learn about the history myself. Overall, I was kind of bored with the movie, to be honest with you. There's so much fascinating stuff to be read just in the history that I don't feel that capturing the mood of it through a film does it quite as much for me. Just things like learning that the German army stopped their advance for 48 hours to regroup before pushing to the beach, when if they had kept going they might have been able to eliminate the French and British armies right there on the beach before they got across, and then hopped across the channel to England and easily taken over England. Or even with the successful evacuation of Dunkirk, had Hitler listened to his commanders and invaded England immediately rather than turning east to focus on the Soviets, England would have been lost in either case. And there's so many individual stories of what happened, there's so many interesting what-if scenarios that could have happened, and all of these things I am much more interested in reading about than trying to capture the overview in a film like Dieppe. So overall it was kind of entertaining, but not necessarily my style of movie. I appreciated that they broke with sort of the normal Hollywood tropes, and they did focus on the events of Dieppe, which I thought was cool. Overall, it was kind of fun to watch, but yeah, I'll stick with the history. So speaking of reading about the history, I got a chance to reread The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan, a book that I had read some years back and remember enjoying. It's a fascinating book. First of all, the author, Cornelius Ryan, was present on D-Day as a war correspondent. He actually flew across in one of the initial bombers that was softening up the German defenses prior to the landing. And the bomber he was in had been hit by enemy fire, had lost an engine, and barely limped back to England. And at that point, Cornelius Ryan got on a boat and then sailed back across the channel later in the day. So he was there when this history was happening. But what makes this book so special is it was written only 14 years after D-Day, I believe. And up to that point, most books that had been written about D-Day and about the war had been written by the commanders as broad overviews of the events that had happened and sort of the way things went down. But Cornelius Ryan really wanted to focus on the stories of the individuals that were involved in these events. And so what he did was carried out hundreds of interviews over a period of a couple of years at least. And he wanted to hear from people on all sides of the D-Day events. So he went to England, he interviewed British soldiers, he went to the US, he interviewed American soldiers, he went to Germany to interview the German soldiers, he went to France, interviewed people who lived on the beaches and in these towns that all of a sudden found themselves in the midst of a huge conflict. He talked to some of the French resistance fighters who were involved, and he compiled hundreds of stories from these people. And from that vast list of participants, he compiled this book. Obviously, he had to limit what he could put in the book, so he really decided to stick with the stories that could be most accurately verified as being true. And as a result, what you get with this book is a very personal history. And that's why I love to read about history and nonfiction events. It's not as much about the events themselves that brings me into that. It's more the stories of how the individuals participating in these events were affected by them, reacted to them, and experienced them. And so this book for me is just amazing. It's just chock full of fascinating stories that you would not have otherwise learned about. As one example, when the paratroopers dropped behind the beaches in Normandy prior to the landings, it was late at night, pitch dark in the French countryside. They were scattered all over the place and trying to find each other to go after their objectives. This one particular paratrooper had managed to find a few of his colleagues, and they had this little clicking device so that they could identify each other in the dark if they were unsure whether the person they heard in the bushes ahead of them was a German soldier or an ally. They could click their device and get answering clicks in return. And so this small group of Allied paratroopers were walking down this little country road in the darkness at night, and they faintly ahead of them saw a small group of soldiers coming their way. So they clicked their device. They thought they heard an answering click in return, but as they continued to walk down this road, all of a sudden, out of the darkness, as they got very close to each other, they realized that the helmets worn by the opposing soldiers were German helmets. And right at the exact same time, the Germans walking their way saw their helmets and realized they were walking toward a group of Allied soldiers. However, by that point, they were so close to each other that had one of them fired a shot, they would have all started firing at each other at point blank range, and it just would have gone very badly for all of them. So the Allied soldiers decided to just look straight ahead, keep on walking down the road, pretend nothing was happening. The German soldiers did the same thing, basically practically brushing shoulders as they were walking down the road past the Allies, just looking straight ahead, pretending they didn't see anything, and off they went to their various aspects of the battle. So this book is chock full of fascinating little stories like that, and I just loved it. I was able to borrow this particular edition from my brother-in-law. It's the 70th anniversary collector's edition, and this is the reason I decided to reread the book, was because I got this amazing edition to borrow. It comes in this kind of folio case, and then the book itself has, I think, 7 or 8 envelopes. Yeah, it looks like 7 envelopes, that each one of which is stuffed full of copied material. Most of it are copies of Cornelius Ryan's typed out interview notes. There are copies of various German and Allied war documents. And so there's all this bonus material that wasn't in the original edition that gives further context to the stories that are told in the book. And I read every word of these things. I just found it all extremely fascinating. It's a big, beautiful book. Don't want to give it back to my brother-in-law, but I guess I have to. So how do you respond to perhaps the most horrific events in human history? Well, you play some family board games to reenact them, of course. So first up, I have a game called Attack. This game was responsible for my reintroduction to the hobby of board gaming back in 2003. As a child, My favorite game was a game called Shogun, which was also called Samurai Swords, and was renamed again later on to Yakuza. But it was a big Axis and Allies style game of conquering each other's territories that was set in Japan. Attack is a similar deal. It's a huge, grand, strategic, worldwide game that's in the style of Axis and Allies, where players are competing to take over the world. So what I have here is the deluxe expansion box. It only shows the eastern half of the map with the expansion. If you get Attack, you definitely need to get either the Attack expansion or the Attack Deluxe expansion to complete the game. When you combine the expansion with the original eastern half of the map, you actually have a game board that's 6 feet long by 2 feet tall, so it's a massive map of the world. When you combine the expansion with the base game, you also have more than 1,000 little plastic soldiers, infantry, planes, boats, all kinds of stuff, tanks. And what this is a game that you would play with 5 to 7 of your meanest friends as you all spend an entire day bashing each other's armies and territories and just do a Axis and Allies style game of world conquest. I actually haven't played this game in about 10 years almost, but it's hard to dump your first love, so I'm kind of hanging on to it in the hopes that it might see play again in the future at some point. So now we go from the grand strategic level to the squad level tactical game with Heroes of Normandy. I've never been a true war gamer in the sense of these huge, complicated war simulations with hundreds of tiny little cardboard counters and all that stuff. Heroes of Normandy is about as close as I get to that, with its counters representing the military units and its squad level tactical battle system. Speaking of D-Day, this is sort of the era of the war that's covered with this game. I have the D-Day expansion, I have the Saint-Marie-Église expansion. There are 2 other expansions you can get for Corentin and for Pegasus Bridge if you want to really fill out that full D-Day experience. There's so much content in this game, it's all gorgeously produced. All of the maps, the counter illustrations, all full color, really nicely stylized. Love the artwork in this game. It's a game that you would play against a single opponent. You'd set up one of the many different scenarios and go head to head in some tactical battles. Unfortunately, I've just actually sold this game because I needed the cash, but they do have a version of it on PC through Steam, I believe. So I did get hold of that so I could continue to play the game here at home. But it's fantastic, I highly recommend this one. Okay, we've gone from the grand strategic to the squad level, and now we're right down to the individual soldier with V-Commandos. Interestingly, the Heroes of Normandy series comes from a couple of guys in France, and V-Commandos here is from a guy in Quebec, Canada. So obviously the French have been producing some excellent Second World War themed games recently. With V-Commandos, I have a couple of expansions, Secret Weapons and The Resistance. This is actually a fully cooperative game where players are working together as Allied commandos, sneaking through various German installations, attempting to sabotage them or carry out various objectives. The trick is to do it quickly before the area becomes overrun by enemy soldiers, while also doing it quietly and trying to avoid setting off alarms or making your presence known. So it's a tense game of stealthy actions. V-Commandos is quite a nicely produced game as well. It comes with a lot of really nicely illustrated boards and tokens and counters. I've only just begun to explore the introductory learning scenarios on my own, but I'm looking forward to giving it a try with my primary gaming partners once I've learned the system. So there's the Second World War in film, literature, and board game form. It's important to learn history, because if we know history, we can prevent it from being repeated. Hey, Josh here, just wanting to thank you for sticking through right to the end of this video. It really means the world to me. If you want to support me, you can give me a thumb up on the video. I would love it if you would share the link to this video with one other person that you think would find it interesting, and I really hope I'll catch you next time. Cheers. Somewhat coincidentally, I've been somewhat immersed in World War... I said somewhat twice. Somewhat coincidentally, I've been... world. And I have a grandfather who served as an infantry games of what I don't think it did as well was capture a handful of them in. I found even with a successful evaluation of oh my god. Ow! What do I want to say about it? I'm going to start this again.